Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to you all from the Kylemore Global Center today. I hope you all are well and have your Christmas jumpers, sweaters on for today's session. I'm wearing green for Kylemore. Thank you for joining us for our third installment of this Christmas series of the Kylemore Book Club. We're on our week 2 of 3 weeks of a Kylemore Christmas. My name is Lisa Caulfield, and I'm the director of the Notre Dame Global Center located here at Kylemore Abbey in County Galway. And I'd like to warmly welcome all the new participants to our ever-growing book club numbers that seem to be getting bigger with each week. To date, we have 1,137 registered participants joining us from around the world, representing 25 countries. So a really warm thank you to you all for joining us and for registering on the ThinkND platform, who've been wonderful partners through this whole series of creation and really trying to do the best we can during a pandemic and building community with you all. At this point, I normally thank the sponsors of the Kylemore Book Club who have helped make this a reality each week, in and out. And I feel like in the spirit of gratitude, it's always important to remember those who help things make this sort of thing happen. So in particular, I'd like to thank Notre Dame International, the Keough Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, the College of Arts and Letters, the Keough School of Global Affairs, Notre Dame Learning, the Snipe Museum, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Just so you know, if you're new to the session today, we do have an author with us who will speak about her work. And generally, we let our panelists speak for a few minutes about the work that she's shared with you. And then towards sort of the halfway mark of our experience, we're going to have a 10-minute breakout session. And what that means is that we're going to put you all into groups where you get an opportunity to meet your fellow book club participants, to share your impressions of what our panelists, our author has shared with you, and then also decide to share any of your own experiences of the book club. And what we found over the time of doing this is that we hear wonderful stories. We hear wonderful stories of people connecting, of meeting, faculty meeting students, graduates meeting other graduates, and parents meeting, other alum. So it's actually a really nice opportunity to meet other people. But should you not wish to join the breakout session, you don't have to go. You can stay in the main room, and then once the 8 minutes are up, the rest of the book club participants will rejoin. Now, if you have any questions you'd like to submit to our panelists today, then please use the Google form that we're sharing with you in the chat function. This will allow us to facilitate the questions and group them accordingly so that we get to them in a timely manner. Again, we'll try to, you were quite popular last week, and we'll try to answer as many as we can to get them to you in a timely manner. But should we not get to all the questions, we will continue to discuss more books, if you like, on the LinkedIn discussion board that we've created. So I encourage you to join the discussion board. And also, while you're on it, share books that you're reading now or suggestions for future books that we can do together. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce this week's special author. Our session is called Spinning Yarns, Fairy Tales, Textile Art, and Story Structure. It is a distinct pleasure and honor to introduce you to you all to a New York Times bestselling author and Notre Dame postgrad alum, Betsy Cornwell. Betsy Cornwell is a New York Times author living in the west of Ireland. She is a story editor and a contributing writer at Parabola magazine. And her short form writing includes fiction, nonfiction, and literary translation. Betsy has worked with us in creating creative writing retreats here at Kylemore, where we bring non-Notre Dame students. We can bring people who are fledgling writers, people who are established writers, people who would like to spend time with writers for a weekend with other writers. And so Betsy has led and has been faculty in these programs for us. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Betsy and have her begin with a brief discussion of the book and an overview of the pre-recorded videos that we shared with you on the platform of Think Indie. Betsy, welcome virtually to Kylemore.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm really so excited to be participating in the book club. I am a 2012 Notre Dame M.F.A. alum, and it's really a huge honor for me that my book was chosen for this group, and I really appreciate your taking the time to read my work and listen to me talk tonight. So I'm speaking to you now from my home in Connemara in the west of Ireland, about an hour from Kylemore Abbey. And I just want to say, as a sort of preamble to everything else I'm going to say, that I'm a single parent and I have my 3-year-old next to me right now. So if there are any sort of strange noises happening, or requests for cookies, which I knew was going to happen, I have my cookies here to hand out to him so that he hopefully won't interrupt my talk too much. But again, thank you so much for reading my work and for taking the time to come to this session today. So I'll just talk a little bit about my inspiration for writing Mechanica and the other work that I do, which is mostly with retellings of classic stories. And why I'm so interested in retellings of classic story structure, how that relates to my work with textile arts and knitting, and how I think it's especially appropriate to the Christmas season that we're in right now, which is the time of renewal in the yearly calendar. So I remember wanting to be a writer when I was 6 years old. I don't remember learning to read, but I have always wanted to be a writer. My teacher had the class make books out of stapled construction paper, and I saw my name on that construction paper book, and I knew that I wanted to have my name on real books someday. I always loved to read. I was kind of a lonely kid, and books were a real lifeline for me. The biggest reason I write for young people now is because, as C.S. Lewis said, we read to know that we're not alone. And books gave me company and gave me community and gave me new life even when I was a young person, and a life that I found constantly renewable in my own lifelong work as a writer and especially as a reader. So stories, yes, you can have a cookie. Stories are a constant source of renewal for me. And that's, I think, one of the things that drew me in particular. You're welcome, to retelling classic stories. All my published books so far, I have 5 that have been published, the most recent one in June of this year, and I have one more coming out in September of next year, are retellings of classic tales, and they're actively in conversation with older versions of their source texts. So for Mechanica, which I'm going to talk about today, that's of course in conversation with older versions of Cinderella. Cinderella being one of the most popular and widely known stories in all of human civilization. There's an 8,000-year-old story version of Cinderella from ancient China. There's a version from ancient Egypt. You can find variants of this story all over the world. Jungian psychologists would argue that it's a significant part of the collective unconscious of these stories that humans all share in common. And I read and watched on screen a lot of versions of Cinderella as I was growing up. And then when I was an undergraduate at Smith College, I took a class called Fairy Tales and Gender, which helped me start thinking in an active way about what these stories had told me as a woman and how I might actually have been shaped by them, and how I might either fit my life to them or push back against them. I was interested in the structure of fairy tales and as these sort of perfectly engineered stories. As I said, I always wanted to be a writer, but the feedback I got from writing teachers when I was very young was that I was good at descriptive writing and poetry and characterization, that kind of thing, but that my weak point was plot, that I didn't know how to create a plot. And so I looked at fairy tales, and especially when I took this fairy tales class, and I thought, these are plots that are so perfect that they've survived over time, over centuries, and through cultures, and traveled all over the world. There's something about them that's so good, so compelling, that they have survived longer than any other story. You can have one more cookie. So Cinderella to me was one of the most perfect examples of kind of story structure engineering, where everything in the story was designed to get her to this ending. And that was something that I simultaneously adored. Cinderella has always been one of my favorite stories. And that also, as a young woman in her early 20s, that I found a little bit restrictive, that I sort of felt like fairy tales were telling me there was only one version of a happily ever after. And so I started to think about, would it be possible to have a fairy tale heroine, to have a Cinderella figure who could actually reach inside of her own story structure and rebuild it in a way that would suit her more particularly, instead of this sort of generic happy ending that is supposed to be one size fits all, unlike the shoe, right, in Cinderella. So I started thinking about story structure as really a structure, as a machine. And if I could have a Cinderella who worked with machines, who was a mechanic, who was an inventor, and could create her own happy ending by building her own mechanical horse and carriage, and also metaphorically could reach inside of the Cinderella story structure and rebuild it in a way that suited her in particular. So I was simultaneously coming at this retelling of Cinderella that I started working on as an undergraduate, and then I actually finished in my time at Notre Dame as a graduate student. I was coming at it both from a place of adoration and from a place of sort of almost frustration of just feeling as a young person like I was being told there was only one way my life should go. And in that way, the Cinderella story has always been kind of the perfect kind of story for me to retell, because when I look for stories that I'm going to engage with enough to write a whole novel about it, it's not necessarily going to be a story where I think everything is perfect exactly the way it is. It's going to be a story that holds enough tension with me that I feel like I can add something to it. And I don't mean that in a definitive way where I'm sort of, I wouldn't be arrogant enough, I would hope, to say that I'm definitively improving on the Cinderella story. I think such a thing would be impossible. But what I find so compelling about these classic tales is, again, that they've survived so long across different tellings and different cultures and times. And then I wanted to add something to that ongoing conversation. So I love and respect and adore so many other iterations of the Cinderella story, but I wanted to be able to add my own voice to that conversation. And that's something I tried to do in my other novels. So far, I've retold Robin Hood in my book, The Forest Queen, and Snow White and Rose Red in my most recently published novel, The Circus Rose. And in my upcoming book that's being published next year, I'm working with Jane Eyre, which is not a fairy tale, but is, of course, a classic and much beloved story. So I sold Mechanica at the same time as my first novel, Tides, which is a retelling of an Irish fairy tale called The Selkie Bride. And I wanted to talk about that for just a minute, because I think I approached it in a similar way, as a story that I both loved and felt some pushback against. And that's exactly, I think, where, these ideas of continuing the conversation of classic story structure become so important.
Where's that treasure?
There's the treasure, sweetie. Sorry, my kid has some pirate toys that are also hopefully distracting him.
Where is a treasure?
There it is, sweetheart. So when I was only 7 or 8 years old, Thank you, sweetheart. Mommy needs to talk to people for a minute, okay? Thank you. I went to a cultural heritage festival with my Girl Scout troop that my mom was a leader of. And that was one of the first places that I encountered an Irish fairy tale or myth that, set me on this path that led to me moving to Ireland 7 years ago. And now, living here, raising my child here, and currently in the process of applying for Irish citizenship. So thank you, sweetheart. So in the sort of talent show portion of the festival, a young girl of Irish heritage and her mother came out and sang together a ballad which told the story of the Selkie Bride. And basically what that is, a Selkie is sort of like a mermaid. You may have seen the wonderful film, The Secret of Roninish. They're seals that can turn into people by shedding their seal skins. And the story of the Selkie Bride is a fisherman one day or one night is on the beach and comes across a group of women singing by the sea and a pile of sealskins, and he steals one of the sealskins, and that means that the Selkie to whom it belongs is in thrall to him and can't go back to the sea with her family, but has to stay with him. Just a minute, honey bun. And so she stays with him, and they marry and eventually have children, even though she always longs to return to the sea. But he keeps her sealskin hidden so she can't find it and she can't leave him. And one day, one of her children discovers the sealskin hidden in the attic or hidden in a trunk, brings it to her mother. Yep, you can have another cookie. And asks, "Mother, what is this?" And the Selkie says, "Careful." Yes, you do have to be careful. The Selkie says, "That's my sealskin, and now that I have it, I have to return to the sea." And when they got to that part of the ballad, the mother and daughter stopped singing, and the mother said, I'm going to sing this next verse in Irish because when I sing it in English, it always makes me cry. And so they sang the verse where the Selkie tells her child she's leaving in Irish. And honey, 1 minute, okay. And of everything that I saw that wonderful day at the festival, that was the thing that stuck with me the most. And as my mother and I were driving home, my mom said that was the thing that stood out to her the most too. And she said, I really wish that they had sung that verse in English, because I can't imagine what a mother would say to their child when they're leaving them forever. And, I was only 7 or 8 at the time. Of course, I wasn't a mother then. And my first thought was, well, of course she left. She'd been kidnapped. She'd been kept, against her will for years. Like, why would she not leave this horrible person who'd been keeping her trapped? And so realizing that my mother and I had such different takes on the same moment in that story sort of gave me an early window into how complex and multi-layered stories can be and what different things they can mean to different people. And it was that paradigm that I took with me really through all my budding years of becoming a working writer. And that led me to write Tides, my first book, which is a modern day reworking of the Selkie Bride story, and which led me to sort of want to have a dialogue with older versions of stories like Cinderella. And has also sort of helped me in my more visual arts work as a textile artist, as a knitter, as an embroiderer. I'm really interested in working with vintage fabrics, with older textiles, and reworking them. Really interesting, and using them to tell new stories. One of my most recent textile art pieces that I'm really proud of uses old onesies that my baby has grown out of and that I've sewn things onto, and to sort of tell a different story with those older garments. And so I'm really interested in ideas of mending and renewal and reworking and adding to the conversation of an object, whether that's a story or a garment or yarn. And so for me, it really is about looking at something and respecting the fact that it has stood the test of time far more than anything I've made up myself, but also thinking about how can I engage with this wonderful thing? How can I add to this conversation? So again, the other stories that I've worked with so far are Robin Hood and Snow White and Rose Red, and my upcoming book, Jane Eyre, which I'm really excited about, which is again a story I encountered as a young child and have had many different, I've been assigned it 4 or 5 times over the course of my academic life and had a significantly different reaction to it each time. So it's a story that excites me and that I engage with and that I push back against different parts of it at different times in my life. And that's really exciting for me. So through all of those, I've really come to believe in a profound way that this idea of classical story structure, some people would say it's formulaic, some people would say it's repetitive or derivative. But for me, it really offers a profound insight into the rhythm of human life. And there are a lot of scholars who have tried to chart classical story structure visually. There's a wonderful charts that you can find of the hero's journey that are usually shaped like a circle, which is really beautiful. I know George Lucas keeps a framed chart of the hero's journey in his office and referred to it very closely in writing the Star Wars films. That Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite writers, charted a linear map of story structure in which it looks remarkably like a heartbeat on an EKG machine, that the most basic classical form of storytelling literally looks like what a human heartbeat looks like if you trace it out on a page. And so that to me says it all about why looking at old stories and renewing them again and again is such a profound human experience and is so important, because through telling stories, we are talking about and making explicit the inner rhythms of our own lives. And that's been really helpful for me in the last few years as I've experienced a lot of upheaval and renewal in my own life. When I first came to Ireland, I married a handsome, charming Irish horse trainer, and I really thought that I had found a happily ever after. But it turned out to not be quite that simple, and he and I are not together anymore, and I find myself a full-time single parent, which is not the life I anticipated when I first came here. But I have found that in many ways, it suits me really well in a way that I could never have imagined before my life took this turn. And I have now just in the last few months moved into an old knitting school in the middle of Connemara that I'm working on renovating and renewing into what I hope will become an arts retreat for other single moms like me. And what's been so profound for me about that experience is really the same as what I found in doing my fairy tale retellings. It's looking at at something that has stood the test of time, something that has been wonderful in the past in its own right, and thinking about, okay, how can I add to this conversation? And in the Knitting Factory where I'm living now, the conversation is with a building, which is a new and different experience for me than having a conversation with a story, than having a conversation with a piece of art or a piece of textile. And yet, thematically, it really feels the same. I'm living in this building that used to be a knitting school and a knitting factory that was later made into an Irish language cinema in the 1970s. That was a jewelry making studio in the 90s and has been a sort of vacant vacation home for the last 10 years. And I'm adding to the conversation of this building and saying, okay, it's wonderful that it's been all these things. And I think this is what it should be now. And that excites me in the same way that retelling these classic stories like Cinderella and Mechanica has done. And that's what I always find profoundly moving about the new year, about this time of year, is this sense of renewal and the sense that we can add to the conversation and keep moving forward. So that's what I hope I've done with Mechanica, and that's what I hope to do sort of in my work writ large. So the question that I would hope to ask you guys in your breakout groups today is just to think about what are the stories that have been really compelling for you, maybe especially in your youth and your childhood. Not necessarily your favorite stories, but what were the stories that stuck in your mind? Maybe because something about them bothered you, like the way the Selkie story bothered both my mother and me for different reasons when I was 8 years old, like the way the Cinderella story felt constrictive for me when I was 22. And what are those stories, and how do you think you might add to the conversation about them? Mommy. I would love to hear about that from you. Hello, sweetheart. Would you like to say hi?
Hi.
Hi. There we go. Good job. All right. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Betsy, and thank you, Donica, for providing all the cookies that we got to eat virtually. Betsy, I thought that was really fascinating, especially when you talked about textiles. And I think there's a lot of knitters on the Zoom call as well that would have some interest in what you said. I feel like for writers that write and how you draw a parallel to your own creativity in your work with knitting too. So I want to encourage those of you in the breakout sessions, if we do have knitters, to declare yourself a knitter and perhaps share a favorite stitch, if that's what it's called, crochet, and declare it, and maybe even swap some ideas that you may have. So we're going to break out for a few minutes, about 8 minutes, and then we'll come back into our main session. Hello, and welcome back to Betsy's discussion now with you feeding the questions, not only to me, and I'll be asking Betsy on your behalf some of the questions that you might have gotten from your breakout session. I hope you enjoyed that time with your other book club participants. And I'm just going to launch right into it, Betsy. We've got a question pretty quickly from Andra. I didn't know that Indianapolis was Kurt Vonnegut's hometown, but Andra asks right off the bat, what is your favorite Kurt Vonnegut work?
So my favorite novel of his is Slaughterhouse-Five. I first was assigned it as a high school student and come back to it all the time. It's absolutely a brilliant book. Yes, you can have my bracelets. And I think my favorite work of his is actually the discussions that he gave about story structure, which I referenced in my talk earlier. And you can find on YouTube, you can find his lectures that he gave about story structure, and they're just so profound and beautiful. And he has a great sense of humor. He tells them in a really accessible, funny way, but offers these amazing insights into humanity through story. And you can find them for free on YouTube. So I definitely advise you to look up his lectures. But yeah, my favorite novel of his is Slaughterhouse-Five for sure.
Well, you mentioned the story structure of Kurt Vonnegut, and he strikes me as someone who's very self-aware of his, he's just very self-aware of his writing, the use of his story structure, and very, very self-aware. And yourself using the Cinderella structure for Mechanica. As a writer, are you conscious of patterns in your own writing or in the writing process you endeavor?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm kind of at this point, I started to wonder at this point in my life if I'm sort of too aware of story structure all the time, because I think I sort of try to apply it in my own life in ways that aren't necessarily helpful. Like I sometimes catch myself thinking that I should do something because it would make a good story, or, you know, expecting something to happen in my life because it's what would happen in a novel, which is of course ridiculous. And so I think it's important to, you know, I sort of live and breathe story structure at this point, and I see stories everywhere because that's, you know, it's my life's work really at this point. And so I think one of the things I love about Vonnegut is his sort of wry and self-aware approach to those things, that he can sort of be telling a wonderful story at the same time as he's kind of stepping back from it and giving you a little wink and a nod. And that's a real sign of a master, I think, that I'm still hoping to work towards myself.
I would say when reading Mechanica, Nicolette is a very self-styled heroine that you've deliberately created as your female heroine in the story. She takes charge of her own life and is kind of self-guided. It's through actually the work that she does with textile crafts that she finds her empowerment and control of her own destiny. And her mother that you've created as an engineer is also a self-made maker. How the process of like textile art and the, you know, the pattern structure, to follow up from that question, fits into your character development?
Yeah, it was really important to me that sort of both mechanics and textile art were part of how my heroine finds her empowerment and finds her happy ending in the story. Because, you know, first of all, I mean, I already talked about how I saw the story as a machine and how mechanics would fit into that thematically. But in terms of textile art, and textiles, I should say, you know, Cinderella is a story that revolves around a dress and a shoe in a lot of ways, around fashion and clothing as this marker that allows her to go to the ball and meet the prince. And I really was interested in the parallels between work with textiles and work with fairy tales as both these kind of feminine art forms that have sometimes been derided as less serious. Yes, honey, by the literary establishment and by the art establishment. And so it was really important to me that it was through textiles that Nicolette, my heroine, finds her way through her story. And so she creates a knitting machine early on in the story. She sort of barters for the material she needs to make her own wardrobe by fixing someone else's sewing machine. It is, you know, so she uses both this sort of traditionally masculine idea of the mechanical and this traditionally feminine idea of the textile in order to find her own way through her story. And as someone who, you know, I learned how to knit when I was probably 6 years old from my mother, who learned it from her father, actually, who he always said he learned to knit in the army so he could darn socks. So that's a kind of, you know, surprises people a lot of the time when I say I basically learned knitting from my grandfather who learned it in the army. But these things are really, you know, even though they're gendered in their idea of how we think about them, and that I wanted my Cinderella to be working with these feminine concepts because the idea of telling a fairy tale is a feminine concept as well, but of course have never been limited to just women or just men who work with them. And so I wanted to give, sorry, just a second. Yes.
No worries.
And parenting as well. Yeah. Okay, just a second, honey. As an underappreciated art form. Anyway. So there we go. So
I guess I find that with knitting, it's a way of like imposing control, right? On a kind of a wary yarn or a wary, you know, and I know from my own family that, you know, knitting can be quite like soothing, relaxing, but then it also is a way of imposing order on a disordered kind of like, when you look at yarn and you see it in its such disarray, but actual process of knitting is a way of imposing order. So I think it's a really great metaphor for how you brought together, you know, Nicolette's taking charge of her life and creating, and this process of creation as a way of control as well.
Well, and I think it makes so much sense to me that another phrase for telling story is the one we used for this talk today, which is spinning a yarn. And when you think about the people who told fairy stories, there are often mothers and grandmothers and other female relatives at the fireside, at the hearthside, telling stories to children while they were making garments. And like, you know, I think that's and often in very artistic ways. Like if you look at the Aran cable patterns from the Aran Islands near where we are in Connemara, they're incredibly beautiful and intricate and real works of art. And yet they became sort of like subsumed into the everyday and weren't necessarily venerated. In the same way that telling a fairy tale isn't necessarily going to be venerated the same way as like, you know, Pulitzer Prize winning journalism or a sort of serious adult market literary novel or a poem. And so these are forms that are traditionally dismissed and yet are completely crucial to our lives. Like, you know, fabric is such a fundamental part of the way we live our lives that we don't even think about it most of the time. And so are fairy tales, really, these stories that that we've heard from childhood over and over again that become part of our own paradigms and how we see the world, that we wear like we wear fabric and that we create and recreate constantly. And so I think to be someone who works with yarn and fabric and textiles and sort of imposes order on this formless thing is a huge part of what has helped me to see stories the same way. And so knitting and creating a garment, doing something with your, and, you know, writing is also doing something with your hands, which I was just saying to my university students today. People forget that it's either moving a pen with your hands or typing. It is still a physical movement in much the same way I find that knitting is. And you're doing something that maybe feels repetitive, maybe doesn't always feel like you're getting somewhere, but over time you're creating something intricate and beautiful and imposing order on something that wasn't necessarily ordered before, but in a way that isn't restrictive, but that is generative. And I find that really exciting. Yeah.
Well, I especially like what you just said about like how it kind of connects us to, you know, the past and the history, and it's something that we have to be self-aware of in the creation of art, whether it be writing or textiles. I do want to draw attention to our lookbook that we created with the Snipe Museum. And I know you spend a lot of time at the Snipe Museum when you're a graduate student at Notre Dame. We did select 10 images that were of unique, I suppose, textures that were in the Snipe Museum. And it was just for us to really acknowledge at this moment the Snipe's contribution to, you know, their collection of amazing nativity scenes, and really on unique, I suppose, backgrounds. There's a comb there, a bone comb. So I would encourage our participants, if you hadn't had a chance to look at the lookbook that we were able to create. It's through the help of the Sonite of collecting, and because we can't actually go visit museums at the moment, but having that opportunity to look at the collections of the art that we saw there, it's just to draw a parallel to the Christmas theme that we had for this session, but then also the variance in the process of creating art and acknowledging the collection that this night has. And so we deliberately selected those 10 pieces. So I encourage those of you who were on the call to have a look at it. I do have a question from Catherine here, Betsy, that came in about Mechanica. To what age group is Mechanica intended? And then the second part to that question is, do you read reviews of your own work? And how does that affect your writing?
Yeah, both good questions. So my publisher would tell you that Mechanica is for ages 12 to 18. And it is sort of, I have a couple, my more recent book that came out in June would be really for sort of ages 14 and up, because it's a little bit darker, but Mechanica is pretty accessible to 12-year-olds or even to younger children who are at the reading level of a 12-year-old. I don't think there's anything that would be objectionable for a younger kid. I hope not anyway. But I like to think of my books as crossover books. So, and what I mean by that is that I would hope that they'd be interesting and compelling to an adult audience as well as to a younger audience. One of my other favorite writers, Madeline L'Engle, said that you have to write the book that wants to be written. And if it's going to be too difficult for adults, then write it for children. And she meant that in a kind of flip way, I think, but I really took that to heart. And to me, I write the books that I feel compelled to write, and then whoever they turn out to be for is who they turn out to be for. And so in a lot of ways, I write for a younger version of myself. I write the books that I would have wanted to read when I was a younger person. But when I was a teenager, I was reading a lot of classic literature meant for adults, like Jane Eyre, like Pride and Prejudice. And I sort of came back to children's literature as an adult because I realized how fascinating and profound it can be. So I approach my children's books just as seriously as I do the writing for adults that I do with Babylon Magazine. So I would hope that adults would be as interested in my books as young people. Now, as far as do I read reviews of my own work, I'm sent trade reviews by my publisher. So when a place like, just a minute, honey. sorry, when a place like the Horn Book or Kirkus, our Publishers Weekly, puts out an advanced review of my books in the months before its release, I get those, I read them. My most recent book made the Kirkus Best of the Year list just this month, which I was thrilled about. Kirkus tends to be a particularly scary one, so I'm often a little trepidatious about reading their reviews, but they were really nice about my new one, which was great. And they were nice about Mechanica as well, thankfully. I try to limit my reading of just kind of internet reviews because there are so many of them, and it is very hard not to take criticism to heart. And of course, I want to learn from my shortcomings as a writer, and I always hope that my books improve. But like, there's a point at which you have to sort of shield yourself from just reading a bunch of comments by people who said they hated the book for some reason that I can't control. Like I know that my books will never be for everyone, and so I have to kind of shield myself from that a little bit. Yeah,
absolutely. Betsy, Megan from St. Paul, Minnesota, is asking, are you working on a retelling of Jane Eyre story? Because that story, in a way, is a Victorian fairy tale.
That's a great question. I think there are so many parallels with the fairy tale and the myth in Jane Eyre. Another of my favorite courses that I took in college was on the Brontes and British folklore. And in both Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, you get a lot of sort of layered references to older, darker British stories. Like the Demon Lover is an old story that's retold over and over again, that shows up thematically in both Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, or the Blackjack Davy, which is a character from British folk ballads who is pretty clearly a Heathcliff type of figure, and Rochester in Jane Eyre, Mr. Rochester refers to Jane repeatedly as an elf or a fairy or this sort of non-human thing. That, which is something that caught my ear from my earliest reading of it when I was a child. And I think, right, the Gothic, which really it's a Gothic piece. To me, the Gothic is the same as the fairy tale, and that kind of, yes, and that it gives us kind of a code for talking about things that might have been difficult to talk about, especially in Victorian times. Like, I think Jane Eyre is so moving and profound psychologically, and this idea of the house as this kind of place of secrets and painful history, as a kind of metaphor for talking about human psychology is really interesting, and in a way that that sort of people at the time couldn't necessarily talk about these taboo subjects. The Gothic gave them a way to talk about darkness in a way that was productive and useful, in the same way that fairy tales do. You can't necessarily spell out to a child why they should be afraid of something, but you can do it in a metaphor as a fairy tale that can help to give that child real life advice and a real way to move through the world in a wiser way, without having to directly broach a subject that might be kind of taboo. So I think Jane Eyre and Gothic literature in general, but especially the work of the Brontes, does a fantastic job of applying, something sort of eerie, which I think would apply to both the Gothic and fairy tales, to saying something very true about human life.
My friend Helen from Walnut Creek, California, wrote that in their book, in their breakout session, some of our group love Little Women as girls. That book shows some very different paths for young women.
Absolutely.
Just wanted to get your impressions. What do you think of Little Women?
Oh, I love Little Women. That's another one that my mother read me when I was very young, probably, again, about 8 years old. I always loved it. I always identified the most with Jo, unsurprisingly, because I also wanted to be a writer. I think the recent remake of Little Women, the film, was fantastic. I was really moved by it. I dragged my 3-year-old to it and watched it holding him because he was, thankfully slept through most of it. And I think it's the same thing. It's a story that has survived for a reason because it's still relevant to us now, all this time later. And I loved the new film because I thought it was both respecting the tradition of the canon piece and adding something new to it, which is the goal that I have for my own work all the time. So that it's still a compelling, vital story that right, absolutely offers women several models of how to be in the world and what that can mean, that we're still engaging with that, I think is a really beautiful thing.
We're running out of time and I have so many questions here. And I suppose I'll go to Fritz, who was asking, generally then, do you generally write towards the young adult genre, or have you considered going outside of that genre, or are you?
I mean, I really like writing for young adults. I sort of came, when I was very young, I pictured myself as a serious adult writer. And, but it was through, I ended up getting an internship at a teen magazine and working with young people, and realizing that young people deserve to be taken just as seriously as readers, as adults do. And that I also found a kind of freedom in writing for young people. Like I mentioned what Madeline L'Engle said about that, but that also, you know, the community of writers for young people is so warm and wonderful, in a way that is really helpful for me. And one of my friends who's a scholar of children's literature says that it's because if you're always writing about characters trying to be brave and kind, then of course you're going to be drawn towards learning how to be brave and kind yourself. And in adult literary fiction, that's not necessarily always the case. I mean, the joke about that is that, you know, it's always about aging intellectuals deciding whether or not to have affairs. And, you know, so I think the sort of warmth and sincerity in writing for young people is something that really is compelling to me, and that I didn't always find in the community of adult literary fiction. But I write nonfiction for adults. I write personal essays, and I write critical essays about mythology and fairy tales for Parabola magazine, which is a leading American magazine on religion and mythology. And I'm actually working right now on a proposal for my first adult market memoir.
You draw by yourself.
Yes, I'm writing a memoir about single parenthood and about moving into the knitting factory, and the crowdfunding campaign that I'm running to turn it into.
You draw it by yourself.
So for me,
and you draw by yourself.
Yeah, and I draw it by myself. I don't know what that means.
You know what that means.
Yeah.
I know what that means.
You know what that means? Okay. So that's, I think that's all I have to say about that. So.
Well, just, I guess one last question Fritz had is, have your editors influenced your work?
I mean, so I've had the same editor for all of my books so far, a wonderful woman named Lynn Polvino at Clarion Books. And I've been really lucky that she has been, I feel like she has a profound understanding of my goals for my work. And so she has pretty much, you know, been on board with the ideas that I've pitched to her. And there hasn't been much in terms of sort of substantive thematic edits where she says, no, you should really take the book in a different direction. I feel like we have a lot of mutual trust where now I can propose an idea to her, and, you know, and then by the time I get the draft written, she sort of believes that I'm taking it in the right direction. What I really value from her, she's an amazing sort of pacing and line editor. So she really helps me tighten up the pace of my stories. It is amazing water, and helps me with the sort of artistic construction of my sentences, which is something that I'm really passionate about anyway. The first kind of writing I ever did was poetry, and I still find myself really interested in lyricism and cadence and the construction of a sentence. So that's something that I engage with her a lot.
Well, Betsy and Donica, thank you to you both for this wonderful hour. I'm going to end with a comment actually from Mary. Every time I read a fairy tale to a child, I would think, can someone else please rewrite these to show they can save themselves? A big thank you for doing that. Well done, Betsy.
Thank you so much. That's so kind. Okay, sorry, I can hear my child yelling. Just a minute, honey, I'll be right there. I really appreciate that. That's always what, like I said, when I try to write for my younger self, that's what I hope for too. So thank you so much. I will join you in a minute.
We're there, Donica. Again, a big thank you to you all for joining us this evening, afternoon, or morning, where you may be dialing in from. I would like to say a very special thank you to Betsy for her contribution to this session. And I know what it's like to have a 3-year-old and to be on your own. You're commendable. So you are a wonderful, wonderful gift you gave us this evening. Thank you. Really enjoyed discussing your craft and your skill. And I thoroughly, as I always do, enjoy working with you. We get such amazing feedback from all who participate in your creative writing programs. If you did not have the opportunity to watch the Benedictine Centenary Mass, to the book club participants, there is an opportunity to see the Mass on their church webcam. Zoe's just sharing it in the web chat. They did record it and they have it on their line, and they will be televising masses going forward. So if you're interested in seeing the Benedictines here at Kylemore celebrate their Mass, then you can log into their monastic church webcam. I also like to just tell you about next week. We have two very special guests, Professor Mark Dories, who serves as the artistic director of the Notre Dame's Children's Choir, will be with us, as well as Grammy Award-winning J.J. Wright, who's the director of the Notre Dame Folk Choir. So we'll have some more Christmas music, some more Christmas Advent music, and I hope you can join us all again next week. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Stay well. Be safe. Goodbye.